Um, Welcome to this talk. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Michael Aird. He's a senior research manager at Rethink Priorities. He also co-leads the AI governance and strategy team there. And his talk is about should you make use of existential risk estimates and how? And over to you, Michael. Hope you have a nice time here.
Thanks. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm excited to be here and to be chatting to you. This talk is on should you make and use existential risk estimates and how. I want to first say a little bit about what is the talk and what are these key terms, and then I'll get into the meat of it and it'll get more exciting and scripted and stuff. Firstly, what is existential risk? Just to get everyone on the same page, existential risk is the chance of an event that would permanently, drastically reduce the potential for long-term flourishing in the world, in the universe. So the most obvious example would be extinction, but there's also other ways that we could permanently lose the ability to achieve great things, like if we get locked in to certain sets of values that aren't conducive to whatever's most valuable to achieve. So this is the chance of something like that happening, something about as bad as extinction, either extinction or something else. So really bad, we don't want it to happen. We want this risk to be low. Existential risk estimates is a forecast or estimate of the likelihood of existential risk in general, or a particular type of existential risk, or a particular cause of existential risk. So for example, what is the chance of extinction by a given time? What is the chance that AI will cause extinction by a given time? What is the chance that some sort of biotechnology disaster causes some issue by a given time? The scope of this talk is arguments for and against investing in efforts to make, aggregate, and use existential risk estimates. So why should you or shouldn't you bother spending time, your limited valuable time, coming up with such estimates, gathering together, and paying attention to them and using them to inform your decisions? And also challenges and best practices for if you do try to do these things. Reasons this talk might be useful, final bit of preamble, is I think these estimates should probably be an input into your decisions. So you can push back on that later during the Q&A and stuff, but I claim that one important input into your decisions should be the odds of these various types of existential risk and these various causes of existential risk. Even if you aren't planning to work on existential risk, it still makes sense for you to consider, at least for 5 minutes, whether you should be. And this is one key part of that. Just the same way as I think everyone should think at least a bit about how many of various types of animals there are, how many people in poverty there are, how many people die of various types of diseases. At least briefly consider all the potential biggest problems and how big they are and what causes them in order to inform what you work on and how. Secondly, you could contribute to efforts to make and aggregate and use these things or understand how best to do so. So you yourselves, you aren't just consumers of this, you can also produce these estimates, gather them together, figure out how people can best use them, figure out how to get, for example, policymakers to care about using them, and leaders of big corporations to care about using them, things like that, so they can improve their decisions. And finally, less important, a lot of people in and around the effective altruism community or associated communities do make and use these estimates. They treat them as a big deal. I'm not saying you should believe them. I'm saying it's just interesting to understand why they think that in order to know where are they coming from and how much trust should you put on different people's judgments, different types of estimates, etc. But that's the least important. The most important are these should inform your decisions, I claim, and also you can help contribute to this. I'm very open to counterpoints and debate in the Q&A. There's going to be a few Q&A bits along the way. I'm going to make a lot of claims, and then you can push back if you want. Cool. Okay, so decisions you might need to make. So we're now into the actual talky bit. Also, by the way, I'm on 5 hours of sleep. I tend to talk too quickly, and I've got a foreign accent. So I'll try to keep it slow, and I'll try to be coherent. But feel free to look visibly confused to remind me if I'm going too fast. Decisions you might need to make. Firstly, do you work on existential risk reduction or something else? So we're starting big picture and zooming in. Of all the massive problems in the world that you could contribute your valuable careers to solving, should it be reducing existential risk? In order to make that decision, you need to obviously, one input should be how big are these risks. Secondly, if you might want to work on existential risk reduction, which existential risks? Do you focus on nuclear risk, bio risks, AI risk, climate change, asteroid risk, supervolcanoes? There's a few other things that could potentially be a really big deal. Which one do you focus on? Obviously, a key input there, I claim, should be how big are they? It's not the only input, but it's one input. Another is which specific pathway should you focus on. So let's say you're focused on nuclear risk. If you focus on nuclear risk, is it the risks from nuclear war worsening geopolitics and leading to more of other types of conflict, more chance of people developing and deploying dangerous weapons of other types? For example, nuclear war might be most important via how it affects bio-risk or AI risk, because bioweapons and AI could be even more powerful and dangerous technologies than nuclear weapons. Or is it the risk from nuclear war causing nuclear winter, where a huge amount of smoke gets released, and this blots out the sun, leads to massive famines, could potentially kill billions? Or is it the risk from, let's say, greater than 20,000 warheads used as opposed to a way smaller conflict? So the tail risk of an extremely big conflict. Which pathways from nuclear risk are most important? You can do estimates of that. And these lead to different interventions. So depending on which one you're focused on, you might focus on different interventions. For example, if you're focused on nuclear winter, you might focus on making sure that we'll be able to grow food even if there's nuclear winter. If you're focused on the worsening geopolitics, you might want to just make sure there's never any nuclear weapon used. If you're focused on the 20,000 one, you might be wanting to focus on ensuring there's not a massive arms buildup like there was in the Cold War, because currently there's less than 20,000 warheads in total. But there was, at some point, 60,000. We could get back there. Let's not get back there. If that's the scenario you're focused on, you do that intervention. Which pair of countries or which flashpoint do you focus on? There's lots of different pairs of countries that could go to war. Which one's most likely and which one's the biggest deal should inform what sort of efforts you focus your time on. These are just examples. You can say the same things for biorisk or climate change. To be honest, a lot of this talk also transfers to non-existential risk issues, but I'll focus on existential risk. Finally, which interventions? I've already touched on this a bit. So for example, within nuclear risk, you could focus on no first use, where countries pledge that they won't use nuclear weapons first. You could focus on new arms control agreements, but if so, what agreements and between who? You could focus on causing a switch to smaller, more accurate nuclear weapons, so that there can be then fewer of them, and they have less chance to cause nuclear winter. Which of these scenarios you're focused on will affect which of these interventions to focus on. And this can all be informed by your estimates of these different issues. So these are some concrete examples of a broader thing, which is prioritization. This is a key thing that EA is trying to do, and that various people in EA and adjacent to EA are trying to do. We have limited resources. We have limited time, limited money, limited careers, limited political capital, limited influence. What do we focus that on? So, for example, each of you could probably have a quite impactful career. How should you use it? For another example, I previously did research on risk from nuclear weapons myself. That's why a lot of my examples are that. But I've now pivoted into focusing more on AI risk. Was that a good idea? Was that the right pivot for me to make that's partly informed by these estimates? I know a lot of people who care about effective altruism principles and could probably influence major decisions by major governments. What areas should they build expertise in, build connections in, build credibility in, and focus on influencing? And note, this is all partly this prioritization stuff. It's partly about what would actually be net positive, which changes in the world would actually make things better rather than worse, because some well-intentioned things can backfire. There's a lot of ways when you can do something that seems like a good idea at first glance, but actually makes the world worse overall. But it's also about what's the most net positive with our limited attention. And there's a lot of factors that go into answering these questions, including moral beliefs and personal fit. For example, part of why I pivoted from nuclear risk into AI governance is that in AI governance, I had the opportunity to build a growing team and manage a team, and that seemed like the best personal fit for me rather than doing research myself. So this wasn't actually about existential risk estimates in that case, or wasn't primarily or solely about that. I'm not saying that existential risk estimates are the key thing or the only thing you should focus on. I'm just saying they're one key factor. You should also consider other things like personal fit and the opportunities available to you. But I still think this is a really pivotal set of factors. Okay, so examples of specific crucial questions, returning to a similar point but trying to make it more specific from a different angle. What are some specific questions that seem really important that you could in theory get good okay, better than nothing estimates of, and you might want to get such estimates of. So focusing again on nuclear war as an example, one question is how likely is nuclear war in the next 10 years? This is a sub-factor in how likely existential risk from nuclear war is, and seems pretty important for what you should do, whether you should work on this and how to work on it. Another is how likely is a nuclear war involving at least 100 detonations on cities? So if there is a nuclear war, it might not have 100 detonations on cities. If it doesn't, that makes it a way smaller deal. Still terrible, but in order to get nuclear winter and in order to get a lot of the immediate casualties, it would need to be hundreds of weapons on cities. It's so much worse if it is. So this is very relevant to what we should focus on. How likely is the collapse of civilization due to nuclear war? So let's say there is a nuclear war. So I'm personally focused on the long-term future, effects on far future generations, or over many, many generations rather than just the present. And for that, a key variable is not just like how bad nuclear war is in the short term. That obviously matters hugely, but for me, it matters even more how big a deal it has on the huge numbers of generations to come. And so civilizational collapse is a key thing there. How much of this risk comes from each potential country pairing? Which interventions could overall reduce rather than increase nuclear risk? For example, a lot of things that seem like, oh, that seems nice, that will reduce the chance of war or reduce how bad war would be, that might undermine deterrence and therefore might actually make a war more likely. So there can be backfire effects in this sort of complicated strategic domain. You've got to be pretty careful. And by how much the interventions reduce risk? How much will these interventions cost? And there I mean in expectation. So I'm not talking about, I know for sure this would cost $2 million and it will reduce risk by 2%. And if I do it, that's definitely what's going to happen. It's more like, if I do this, there's a 10% chance that it reduces nuclear risk by 5%. There's also a 90% chance it has no effect. And then you multiply out those probabilities by consequences to get the expected value. So I'm focusing on expected effects. So all of these are things, if I was trying to think, do I want to work on nuclear risk and how to do so, I'd want to be looking at these sorts of variables and getting good estimates on them, better than whatever I have at first glance when I just first encounter the problem.
Yeah, so I'll say that, for example, how likely is the collapse of civilization due to a nuclear war, for example? So what are the aspects that you do research on to come up with these numbers is what I wanted to ask.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So the question is how to come up with these estimates. Sure, it would be nice if we had them, but how do you actually get them? These seem hard. It doesn't seem obvious. You can just pop some other numbers in, do some math, and get the answer out. I think it is hard. It differs a lot between different questions, but there are some sort of frameworks and methods that are useful. I'll talk about them a bit more later in the talk, but some things are trying to look at somewhat analogous reference classes, things that are kind of similar to what you're focused on here, and how often have those things happened. So for example, if I'm trying to think, how likely is this treaty to get passed? Then I can look at a bunch of other treaties that are kind of similar, that were attempted, and see how many actually went through. Or what effects would the treaty have? I can look at other treaties, other arms control treaties. How often did they achieve their intended objective? Okay, it was 40% of the time, let's say, just an example. So now I'm going to start off thinking it's about 40% likely this new treaty would achieve its objective. Collapse of civilization, really hard, yeah. A decent chunk of this talk is going to be on challenges with making these estimates, so I'm going to circle back to this, but it's a good question. My main claim is just you can get better than nothing. So if I first look at this question, I'm just I don't know. And then if I think about it for 10 hours and read some useful research on it and try to crunch some numbers, I'm a bit better than I don't know. And that's already something. Okay. Yeah, so precise answers seem unattainable, but can we get a little less imprecise? So you mentioned how can we know if it's 90 versus 95%? We generally won't have a very good take on whether it's 90 versus 95%, but I want to be is it closer to 5%, 30%, 60%, 90%. I can at least kind of do that usually. The more precision, the better, but we need to be better than whatever we would have by default. That's all. We need to be enough better than what we'd have by default to justify the time spent, which isn't always worthwhile. I don't always use these estimates every day, but often it's worthwhile. Okay, so some methods for trying to answer such questions. So zooming out of the forecasting thing and then getting back to the forecasting thing. So if you're trying to answer these questions in general, these sorts of things, how can you go about it? So one option that I'm not going to talk about, there's a few I won't talk about, are experts' intuitions. You could ask a bunch of people who've looked a lot at existential risk or at civilizational collapse or at treaties or whatever and say, what do you think? What's your intuition on this question? And they'll give you some numbers sometimes. You might have to really squeeze them to get the numbers. Or they might give you statements like it seems likely or it seems implausible or something. You can say, okay, likely, they probably mean 70%. Implausible, they probably mean 5%. So you get their intuitions. That's something. You could also do qualitative research, try to look at what are the pathways by which this might happen, how likely do they seem to me, and then just how overall, what do I think is probably going to happen without using a bunch of numbers. Quantitative models, where you build a model of how would this play out, and you try to plug in a bunch of parameter estimates and see what that spits out at the end. This sort of thing is used commonly in many industries. It's not used super commonly for these sort of how's the future going to go or geopolitics type things, but you can use it. These aren't what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here are quantitative forecasts, which is when someone gives you a precise number it doesn't mean they're confident of the number, but they give you an actual number, not just a word like likely or implausible, where likely, implausible, remote chance, these can mean very different things to different people. So it can be better to have a number, like 60% means the same thing to everyone. So quantitative forecast, when you actually get a number, whether it's well-founded or not, some of these numbers are garbage, but some of them are useful, and they're at least precise, so you at least know what the person means, even if they're not confident. Phil Tetlock, a political scientist in the US, has done a lot of work on this sort of forecasting stuff. He's written some really useful books on this. So a lot of, like, he's sort of like the part of the, one of the fathers of this kind of thing. Yeah, and so his work expands on this. Another thing you can use is rationales for quantitative forecasts. So you get someone who's used to making quantitative forecasts, and you ask them, and then you ask them some question, and then you ask them, why did you give those numbers? And they take you through their reasoning. Their reasoning will often involve the first three things. Their reasoning for their forecast will draw on expert intuitions, it'll draw on qualitative research and quantitative models, but it'll aggregate all of those into one bottom line, like overall, given all these like disparate inputs that say different things, what do I overall believe? So getting their rationales can be a useful angle because they have a different sort of thinking style usually, that people are trained in doing these quantitative forecasts and have practiced it. They have different thinking styles, different sort of evidence they use compared to many other people. So there's, so that they might contain reference classes, factorizations, ways they break down the question into different component parts, different sources, different lines of reasoning. There'll be Q&A breaks now and then, so if I'm using any terms you don't know, or if you want to like push back on the idea that any of this is useful, you can ask them. Yeah, so these are 5 methods. I'm focusing on these last 2. Caveat, this is just my personal quick breakdown. I'm not saying this is like the taxonomy of possible research methods or whatever. You can also get aggregations of each of these. So for example, literature reviews aggregate qualitative research usually. You can get databases and summaries and means of quantitative forecasts. So we could ask, like, which of these methods are best? Which one should I use? My take is basically that each method is horrifically flawed, but in not fully correlated ways, and they're still each useful if used correctly. So just basically knowing anything about the world is very hard, and it's harder the more niche or unprecedented the thing you're focused on is, and the more in the future it is. This is just hard, and any method will kind of suck, and we shouldn't be very confident in any method. But they can each add some value. They can each make us less idiotic, less confused, and their flaws are somewhat different. They have somewhat uncorrelated flaws, which means using multiple of these is better than just focusing really intensely on one of them. So experts' intuitions have, they're flawed by the fact that experts aren't used to thinking quantitatively, and they don't often put down predictions and find out when they get things wrong. Often they say vague things. They never find out if they were wrong. They don't track if they were wrong. They don't update on this feedback in an explicit way. That's a flaw. Quantitative forecasts fix that flaw. The people are trained with putting down numbers and seeing what actually happened and then updating their beliefs. But meanwhile, the quantitative forecasts are often people who are pretty generalist. They don't actually know much about this topic. They don't necessarily have, they might be missing a lot of key considerations. So these 2 flaws are different, and if you use both methods, you're less blind. You're not going to have like one major blind spot that's missing. You might find the methods say massively different things, and if they say massively different things, then you should be pretty uncertain about the topic, and that's useful to know. They might say pretty similar things, and then you can be pretty confident. That's also useful to know. Cool, so I suggest using multiple methods and seeing what these multiple methods converge on. Okay, and some options for getting individual quantitative forecasts. So let's say I've convinced you. You're like, okay, great, Michael. I'm on board. I want some forecasts. I love it. Gimme. How do you get them? One option is make them yourself. You can just look at a question, try to come up with a forecast. I'll talk a bit later about like how to actually do that, like what are some approaches for making these forecasts. Another option would be you can use crowdsourced forecasting sites like Metaculus. So crowdsourcing is trying to get like a lot of people to contribute to something. There's some sites that do these platforms where questions can be put up, and then like loads of random internet nerds can help out and can like try to answer these questions. And then you can get aggregates of what did all these random internet nerds say. And the aggregates are actually pretty decent. Like these are very helpful nerds. They don't know much about these topics, but if you add them all up and you average them out, you get something fairly good. And I'll show some evidence of that later, at least for the sort of questions they tend to forecast on. But often they're easier questions like, what will Elon Musk do in 2 weeks about a given topic, rather than like, will civilization collapse in 2040 because of nuclear war? That's obviously a harder question. There's also like forecasting tournaments, financial prizes. So people sometimes make these tournaments, and then it incentivizes people. So you don't have to be quite as much of a random internet nerd. You might just want money, or might want like the status of having come first or whatever. And then a bunch of people forecast. You can aggregate those. Prediction markets. Prediction markets try to like simulate how the stock market works, but with people making forecasts. I won't try to explain how it works, but basically it's a different way of getting crowdsourced forecasts with more of a financial incentive, and that can also be useful. Commissioning forecasts from forecasters with strong track records. You can find who often got things very right, and then ask those people, what do you think about this? And you pay them up front. Instead of getting loads of people who don't necessarily have great track records, you get a smaller number of people with really good track records, pay them up front. And then you pay them to like really invest time in. You can also solicit their rationales, like I mentioned earlier. You can ask them, why did you believe that? Can you write up like 500 words on like what the key lines of argument you used were? Again, my take on this is all of these methods kind of suck, but they're all kind of useful, and it's like ideally you'd use multiple of those. If it's a really important question, use multiple of them. If it's a question where you just want a decent answer fast, you might just want to use one of them, whatever's fastest and easiest. So some examples of what this can look like. These are two questions I made on the site Metaculous to get a bunch of people's forecasts of them. I ran a nuclear risk forecasting tournament where I put up like, I don't know, it was like 150 questions that seemed pretty important about how nuclear risk is going to play out and what interventions would be useful, and then incentivized in various ways lots of people to forecast on them, aggregated the answers, made a database with all these things that would hopefully inform future work. Two questions I put on there just to show what sort of thing can happen here. I asked, will there be at least one fatality from an offensive nuclear detonation in the US, UK, or France by 2030 if there's an offensive detonation anywhere by then? So conditional forecast is a thing you can do. So conditional, because this is very unlikely by itself without the conditional, but if we first assume someone does an offensive nuclear detonation, then where's it going to be? I'm interested in finding out, like, if there is a nuclear war, will it involve the US, UK, or France getting attacked? I also asked about all sorts of other countries. It wasn't just focused on them. So then for each country, I have a sense of, like, if there is a nuclear war, how likely are they to get involved? People said 25%. That's already interesting. A lot of people seem to assume if there's nuclear war, like there's a lot of people like in the US or UK assuming if there's nuclear war, we're all dead. According to this, that's not the case. It seems decently likely that there's at least one nuclear weapon, 75% chance it wouldn't end up with any nuclear weapons detonated in these three countries. That doesn't mean it's okay, obviously, but it means it's not necessarily just like a global thing where everyone's gone. Another thing is, will any state test a nuclear weapon with a yield above 30 megatons by 2030? So the biggest nuclear detonation ever was 50 megatons, if I recall correctly. It was by Russia. It was during the Cold War. Since then, there haven't been, there's much smaller nuclear weapons, and there's much less nuclear testing. So I'm asking here, will someone test a bigger nuclear weapon than we've seen for quite a while? People said only 13%. This is some evidence there's not going to be a massive Cold War-style arms buildup with bigger, scarier weapons. It's not perfect evidence, because there might be a massive arms buildup with only smaller weapons, but huge numbers. But this is just examples. And there's the various stats that they show here. Cool. OK, so I've said a bunch of stuff, made a bunch of claims. My first brief Q&A break. If people can pop up hands with anything you're confused about, that you're skeptical of, anything you want to get my take on, and then we'll pass the mic around. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted to ask about the experts. If the experts are not able to talk in terms of numbers, then if a person cannot put a number on whatever they are saying, then how much it can be trusted?
So I think basically we shouldn't. I think the different methods that I sketched earlier, like expert intuitions, qualitative methods, quantitative models, forecast, rationales for forecasts, they aren't exactly answering the same question. They're providing different types of input on a given question that we have. So for experts, I mostly don't just want to trust experts' bottom line numbers. I mostly want to hear from experts what dynamics and factors and variables and considerations I should have in mind. Then I will either myself or get forecasters to pay attention to those dynamics, variables, considerations, factors, and then come up with numbers. I think experts' numbers tend to suck, like their bottom line numbers on a given thing. My understanding is, according to Phil Tetlock's work, he gathered lots of data. There's some questions about this. There's some later work that suggested maybe that isn't the case. But my understanding is that like the experts' numbers tend to actually be worse than forecasters with decent track records. If you just ask them a bottom line question, they aren't used to thinking about exactly that bottom line question, and they aren't used to getting feedback from the world. But they know loads of things that forecasters don't. So a forecaster is going to do way better if you've first asked an expert, like, how would you think about this problem? What should I be paying attention to? And also, you could also get the forecasters to forecast things, write up a rationale, give the rationale to the expert and say, in what way was this person stupid, naive, inexpert, silly? What are the key things they were missing? Then feed that to the forecaster again, get them to update the thing. So it's some sort of like combo move. The best thing is if you get an expert who also has practice doing forecasting and getting feedback. Those people are great, but there aren't that many of them, unfortunately.
Yeah, and one more thing. Can some expert can be trained, like putting effort into training them into thinking more quantitatively in terms of collecting data, like.
Yeah, so you can, so one thing, experts definitely are used to doing quantitative work, like many experts are used to doing quantitative work, but not usually quantitative bottom line estimates of complicated things. They're more used to like answering an extremely scoped down question or gathering a data set or whatever. So yeah, so the thing I was saying before was about like them trying to give the bottom line estimates. Forecasting skill is to some extent a matter of like predispositions. Like there's certain types of people, certain personality types and stuff, and there's like various cognitive skills and personality types that seem to correlate with being good at forecasting, according to Phil Tetlock's work. But there's also a practice component, and there's also like some mindsets that you can teach people and train them to adopt. So it's partly about like teaching them, it's partly about practice, it's partly about predispositions. So you can take a bunch of experts, put them through a course, give them lots of practice, they'll get better. You can also find the like 10% of them who are predisposed to be great but have never tried it, and then also give them the training. That's great. Sometimes people do that. Some of my work has tried to do that. Like the site Metaculus is trying to sort of like nerd snipe a bunch of like professors and academics and experts, get them interested in forecasting, and then help train them up and give them practice. And then those people would be great. But just most of the world aren't experts on any given thing. So usually you don't have many numbers there. Okay, I'm going to move on for now, and then there'll be another Q&A break a bit later. Okay. There was one. Oh, yeah, okay, cool.
Hi, Michael. Felipe from Brazil. Nice to meet you. One thing that I'm wondering is about taking forecasts to drive decision, as in the EA community. So in EA, for example, I have a feeling that we're nowadays focusing way more on AI than global health and development because, there are forecasts that, AI is this huge risk. But when you ask who said this, no one knows. And like, how did they come up with this number? No one knows either. So I'm wondering, when you think about EA, and I do agree with you that, having some forecasts better than nothing, but do you think we're taking these forecasts in the right way to drive our decisions? If yes, why? And if no, what needs to change?
Yeah, so I would break down we. So like any question that's like, are we doing this correctly? Many of us will not be. Like it's a decently big community with a lot of different skill sets and stuff, and like not everyone is like the leading researcher specifically focused on which broad areas to focus on. It makes sense for a lot of people to not have super well-informed opinions on that. They've got other things to do at their time. So a lot of people will be putting too much weight on forecasts or using forecasts incorrectly. Also, a lot of people will be putting too little weight on forecasts, and a lot of people will be putting the right amount of weight and using them correctly. So it varies. I do think the key decision, like the sort of senior decision makers who are guiding the sort of cause prioritization decisions, my opinion is actually they're making pretty good choices. I think they've got like pretty reasonable balances. I don't fully agree with them. There's like a lot of fairly important things I disagree with them on. In terms of my independent impression, where independent impression means what I would believe if I wasn't deferring to anyone. If I wasn't like, well, Bob says this and Bob's smart, so I'm going to update a bit towards Bob. My independent impression differs from the senior decision makers in various ways. My all things considered belief, even when I update towards the fact that they're smart and they've said this, still disagrees with them. But overall, I think they're doing pretty well. I think that, if anything, I would probably want them to use forecasts more and more explicitly. So I'm talking about people at OpenPhil and things like that, Open Philanthropy, which is one of the main funders of a lot of EA stuff. And then in terms of like split between AI and global health development, things like that, I think there's a lot of considerations that go into that. It's partly about empirical beliefs. It's also partly about moral stuff. So a lot of people who disagree might disagree for reasons to do with like not thinking that helping future generations exactly makes sense in a moral sense. but it also can be about empirical disagreements. The forecast can mostly just help with the empirical stuff. There might be like weird ways it can help with the moral stuff, like predicting what philosophers will say in 20 years after they've thought way more, but like mostly it helps with the empirical. I don't think it's the case that like no one knows where the forecasts come from or no one knows how those numbers are generated. In fact, I've made multiple databases of this sort of thing, and so you can like see like who said it, when they said it, and then the link to where they said it. And then in those sources, usually, like a lot of the time, they provide quite detailed reasoning. A lot of the time, they provide somewhat detailed reasoning. Sometimes they just say a number. And then you can just decide for yourself how much to defer to those. And people mostly defer to people seem to mostly defer to the ones that have more reasoning provided and the person has more expertise on the topic, which seems appropriate to me. Definitely loads of people making mistakes. That's always the case. But I don't think it's like overall we're doing too little forecasting. I would like it if people, one thing I would like, and I'll get to this a bit more, is I think a lot of the time people look at like 1 or 2 forecasts, don't look at why that forecast was made, and then just believe that. I would like it if people looked at like a larger set, got some means or medians or geometric means or something. There's like various different ways of weighting these. That's not very important right now, but you can use aggregations and then also dive into the details of some of them and decide who to defer to, how much. I would like it if more of that happened. And I try to make databases to help this happen. For example, like loads of people quote Toby Ord's estimates in the precipice. I think these are good estimates. I like them. But there's like lots of other ones, and it's annoying they just quote Toby instead of also having these aggregates. Cool, all right, on with the show. So now we're into the challenges, which like some of these questions are addressing the challenges. My outline of the challenges of existential risk estimates. There's some hard to avoid issues. We're kind of just stuck with these, and they're a problem, but still this is useful anyway. One of them is it's hard to get relevant evidence to inform these estimates. So earlier there was a question about like, how do you actually get these numbers? And I said with treaties, you can look at reference classes and base rates of like, what about when other treaties have happened? With something like you can't do something like, in all the other times when civilizations went extinct, what caused it? Because that's never happened. The existential risks, by definition, they can basically only happen once, to humanity at least. So we can't get super relevant reference classes. We can't get super relevant evidence on what dynamics inform these things. That sucks. We can still get somewhat relevant reference classes. We can still have ways of breaking down the question. And for example, if nuclear risk involves like 10 steps, we can at least find out how often the first few steps have happened. Like how often has there been a false alarm? How often has there been a threat of using nuclear weapons? Things like that. And we can also do things like what would be required for nuclear risk to kill everyone? Maybe it would require a nuclear winter. How many bombs would have to go off? What sort of climate stuff would have to happen? What sort of agriculture stuff would have to happen? We can at least find that out using regular science. So it's hard to get relevant evidence, but that doesn't like ruin this. It just makes it harder. And also this affects any non-forecasting method. Any experts who tell you something is very likely or very unlikely without giving you numbers, without giving you reasoning, they're also suffering from this issue that it's hard to get relevant evidence to inform the estimates. It doesn't just apply to forecasting. But this is a challenge. Second is how reliable are long-range predictions. There's extremely little evidence on how good predictions are at even more than 5 years, and especially more than 10 or 20 years. So if we're trying to forecast something like AI risk in 2040, there's very little evidence of like how much we should trust that kind of forecast. There is good evidence about short-term forecasting, like up to 2 years or so. And actually, it turns out that it seems to work pretty well, at least for fairly normal questions, and with people who've trained in this, and if you aggregate lots of people. But we don't have much about long range. But it's worth noting, we don't have evidence that it doesn't work. We just have extremely little evidence. And I think there's actually 2 scraps of evidence on this that suggest it does seem to work okay. It works worse than short range, but not like massively worse. There's like 2 tiny bits of evidence, and that's all we've got. And they both seem to me somewhat positive. Like they suggest it's better than nothing. It's better than wild guessing. Even short-range predictions are often unreliable. So I said that they're often pretty good, but they're mostly pretty good if you get a bunch of forecasters who have decent track records. If you don't do that, if you just have like if I just like randomly ask one person with no particular practice, then that estimate probably sucks. So if that sucks, then we should be wary of like a long-range forecast if the person is an experienced forecaster and we've just got one person. Especially wary, because it's also long-range. Okay, but these are hard to avoid. They don't destroy this, but they're hard to avoid, and they make it worse, and they make it less worth spending time on, but I still think it's worth spending time on. There's some other things that we can fix. Also, by the way, the slides, I'll provide a link to those at the end. Issues we could overcome. Do these estimators have a good track record? So forecasting isn't that useful if they don't have a good track record. But we can fix that. We can just give them a good track record. We can just get people to have a good track record and give them practice. We often have only a few estimators. That also makes it less useful. The estimates might not be independent, so this maybe touches on that question that was asked. Often you get like 5 different estimates, but they're actually all driven by a similar source. Like there's actually, they've all read similar things, or they've all read each other, and they're all being influenced by that. So you don't really have 5 estimates. You've sort of got like 2 or something. Estimates we get might be a biased sample. So for existential risk estimates, it might be that the people who think existential risk is a big deal are more likely to bother giving any numbers. Other people just don't look at it at all. And then we might be biased towards thinking it's a big deal. And many estimates are just quick guesses. So someone just like said it quickly, and then I put it in a database, and I'm saying maybe people should pay attention to this. You should be a bit wary of paying attention to it. And precisely what is being estimated. So someone might say, I think existential risk is like 10% or something. Do they mean extinction risk or all existential risk? Do they mean by 2100? Do they mean by 2120? Do they mean in all time? Do they mean just particular sources? It's often hard to know exactly what they're saying. But why pay attention anyway? Alternative options all suck. So as I touched on for one example, but all of these challenges, all of those challenges, I think, at least most of them, apply to other methods as well. Yeah, most of them apply to other methods. So you could try just having no beliefs about likelihoods, but obviously that's not going to work. You do, like, realistically, you will have some belief about how likely various things are, even if you haven't put it in numbers. You could try to ignore beliefs about likelihoods by anyone but you, but that's not useful either. Other people also know things, and any issues with their beliefs are also challenges for yourself. You could just avoid quantitative estimates, but still go with like plausible and likely and all of that, but then that's very unclear, and still most of those challenges apply to that. So I claim that existential risk estimates are still useful, and all that's required for them to be useful is that they make us somewhat less blind, and enough less blind to be worth the time we spend on them. I think I'm nearing the end of what I have to say. And recall that I'm just saying this should be one of the tools we use. I still think we should use other tools. Argument 2 for why to pay attention. Track record of short-term forecasting is actually pretty good, especially given the right forecasters and approaches. These aren't existential risk estimates, but it's evidence that existential risk estimates might also work as well. It's not just like forecasting is ruined. It's not just like forecasting is doomed. Forecasting often works. It's hard to say whether it works for this, but it often works. So this graph, what this is showing is like on the site Metaculus, when the aggregate forecast says a given thing, how often does that thing happen? And you can see as they say it's more likely to happen, in the cases where they say it's more likely, it is more likely. So when they say it's 25% likely, it happens about 22% of the time. When they say it's 75% likely, it happens about 80% of the time. So they're not perfectly calibrated, but they're actually fairly close. Like getting their forecast is still some evidence. What I want to forecast is much harder, but there's still something. There's some evidence. This partly requires large numbers of forecasters. Cool. And third reason, final reason, is it seems unlikely that long-range forecasts with good forecasters and approaches will be literally no better than random chance. Like, I do think it's hard, but I don't see why it would be no better than random chance. And this is weakly supported by the only 2 bits of evidence I know of, as I mentioned earlier. So I've got some links here. You can follow up with them later. This isn't strong evidence, but I basically only know of 2 pieces of evidence, and they both seem to suggest that it is better than random chance. These are for like 5, 10-year forecasts. Oh, and final challenge, turns out this one's the final one, is we can avoid or work around many of the challenges and problems mentioned before. I'll just run through this quickly because I've kind of touched on it as I went, and then I think I'll wrap up, which are, do the estimators have a good track record? That's a challenge, but we can just get forecasts with good track records. We can weight forecasts differently based on track records. So the people who have better track records, we put more weight on whatever they said. We put less weight on the other people when we're doing our averages. We don't just do a raw average, we do a weighted average. We can have them use best practices. We often have few estimators. We can just get more estimators. Estimates might not be independent. We can try to get them to estimate independently. We can like force them to not see each other's reasoning until the end. Estimates we get are a biased sample. We can get new estimates. We can actively commission ones from other people. Then we can aggregate lots of estimates. Many estimates are just quick guesses. We can incentivize people to spend significant time on this by saying it's really important, by saying we'll pay them for results, etc. Precisely what's being estimated, we can ask them to get clear, decision-relevant questions. Okay, okay, this will be the last slide I'm going to do because I feel for longer than I expected. So just quickly on like how to actually make these. This is just fully a quote from another source that I added 2 minutes before the talk lazily, but I think it's a good quote. So this is Tetlock, the researcher I mentioned, describing how he found the forecasters who tended to do well tended to make forecasts. So this wasn't him randomly coming up with a theory. It was like he just observed what seemed to work and then wrote it down. So sometimes a question could be answered more rigorously if it's first Fermiized, which means you break it down into parts. So for example, how likely is nuclear war can be broken down into how likely is nuclear war due to an accidental detonation versus deliberate detonation, and how likely is each different country pairing, and then like accidental, what are the ways the accidental detonation could occur, and then how likely is each of those. So you break it down into parts and estimate each part separately. That can often make your forecast go better. This is now like practical advice when you're out there in the world trying to make forecasts. Next, you use the outside view on the sub-questions, or the main question, and then you adjust your estimates using other considerations, but you do that cautiously. So outside view means try to use like reference classes and base rates and like what typically tends to happen in this kind of situation, rather than like what do I believe is going to happen in this particular situation for particular reasons. That's the inside view. That probably doesn't make loads of sense without examples. I'll link to some posts you can check out. Seek out other perspectives. Don't just go with whatever perspective you've come up with. Try to get many different lines of evidence and perspective and angles and considerations. Repeat those steps until you hit diminishing returns. And then your final prediction should be based on aggregation of these various models and reference classes. Here's some sources you can check out. I'm going to skip a lot of slides that aren't very interesting. And here's the Q&A. Cool. Thanks for bearing with those slides. Okay. Yeah, we'll have the mic go around to people.
Hi. So I think one of the important steps that you missed on the last slide, where you had summarized what a good procedure to make good forecasts would be. So that would be a validation of a model, right? So whenever you make a forecast, there has to be an underlying model which needs to be sound. And an important step in modeling is, I think, validation of the results would have got. So based on, since a lot of things seem quite qualitative and numbers coming from all over the place, so what would be a good validation mechanism according to you, as per like whatever you have seen?
What do you mean by a validation mechanism? Like a way to check that it's a good model?
Let's say there are many. So let's say we are studying some model that about poverty, and we propose a few changes that need to be made, and we say that if this is repeated, many people will get out of the vicious poverty cycle. Mm-hmm. So you make the model, and then you try to determine whether whatever you have predicted is actually right. So what can be done in a real world scenario is that you see where these conditions have been set up, and when these steps are taken take place over a period of time, if the actual results match with what you have forecasted. So to make forecasts better, what kind of validations do you think are required?
Yeah, so I'm assuming you mean like getting feedback on like how the forecast went and like what actually turned out to happen or something, and then learning over time. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, in some sense, I think.
Okay, so firstly I would say forecasts don't have to be based on explicit models. I would say most forecasts should not be based on one explicit model. It's a bad idea for them to be based on just one explicit model. So like, a thing that's worth bearing in mind is basically we implicitly make forecasts on all sorts of things all the time. Like when coming here today, well, maybe many people came from their rooms or something, but like wherever you most recently traveled, including walking down, you had some sort of forecast of how long it would take you to get down there and when the talk would start, and you didn't make a model for that. You had like intuitions based on loads of experience or whatever. You had like a sense of like how far it is, and you have a good sense of how long it takes to walk that. Like this isn't absolutely different from what we're trying to do here. Loads of time we're making forecasts, and usually the way this is done is like a whole mix of things going on. When a forecast really matters, and when it's pretty unfamiliar, we don't have loads of experience with it, it is probably worth making models if it's a really important one and it's a pretty unfamiliar domain. But ideally make multiple decent models rather than one really beautiful model, and get multiple different perspectives. Empirically, that seems to work best. As far as I'm aware, like when this is tried pretty often, and in my experience as well, seems like multiple models seems better. Then trying to get feedback from the world. Sometimes that's just hard, unfortunately. But ideally, if you have a model that breaks down, so for what I'm trying to do, it's hard, because I'm trying to forecast things that would happen decently far away, like more than 5 years away in most cases, and also things where if they ever happen, like it's sort of like one shot or something, including for the interventions. But if you break down like, why do I think this would work, or why do I think this is going to happen, then you can check whether some of the steps of your reasoning apply. So if one reason I believe that AI risk is high is something to do with like, maybe US-China relations seem to be trending towards being worse, then I can at least check that part in the next 2 years. I can't check the whole thing of like how likely AI risk is, but I can check each component part if you have a broken down model. But yeah, try to use multiple models. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but hopefully that's decent, and we'll move on to another.
Yeah, so I'm guessing you would classify a pandemic as an existential risk, right? Event, the pandemic.
Well, so there's an annoying thing with the term, which an existential catastrophe is something where it actually does cause extinction or something about as bad as extinction. An existential risk is something that like could cause that. And so I guess and then also a pandemic, there's all sorts of pandemics. So basically I think most pandemics aren't really an existential risk. Like there's extremely low chance they would cause an actual existential catastrophe, even if they're still a really big deal. Some pandemics would be, mostly human-engineered pandemics of particular types.
So were there any forecasts for the COVID-19 pandemic that happened? Like, let's time travel back to 2017. What were the risks of that happening at that time? Do you know?
So I'm not aware of, there were some qualitative type experty forecasts where some people had specifically noted coronaviruses seem like a big deal. Lots of people, especially in the EA community, so this is, I think, one of the EA community's like wins or like instances of foresight was like noticing this might happen. A loss was that we didn't stop it and we didn't catch it super early and we didn't like cut off the disease really fast. In theory, we could have, and I think with better preparation, the EA community could have done that, and we should like reflect on the fact we failed there. It's not like it was on us or something, like we're a small community, but I think we could have, and we want to make sure that in future we can do that. We want to have like crisis response teams and things like that. But yeah, many people in the EA community did notice that pandemics of various types seem like a much bigger deal than people seem to be treating them as, and there is a significant chance that in the next 10 years or so, there'll be some sort of pandemic at some point, there'll be a really big deal, and we should do a lot more about it. And I think a lot of the interventions they proposed would have been helpful if adopted. They didn't have enough political influence, unfortunately. And then I don't know if there were many quantitative forecasts about pandemics before COVID. Early in COVID, there were loads, and I think Metaculus has done pretty well on COVID, as far as I'm aware. I haven't looked into it in detail.
Can we get the slides? There were a lot of links over there.
Yeah, so is this, let me see. Oh, yeah. If you go to this thing, the top thing, bit.ly/xrisk estimates, that's either these slides or an old version, and then everything else comes from that. That's the master source. Cool.
Thank you.
I think there's a question here. Oh, there's various questions. Okay, cool.
So my question, hello. Yeah. So my question was that you said that people might have bias on a certain estimate, and that might be because of what they know. So basically, what I learned from this entire talk was that we talk to people and to experts and try to figure out what they think about these estimates, and then take an average, unweighted means of those sources. So my question was that, so what do we do while forecasting? So at first we have some data. So we either watch news or we read some newspapers and we talk to people and we gathered some data with us. And then we formulate a model in our head. So basically we think of what might happen. And then according to the current situation, we try to figure out there are two things. That is, one is my intelligence, and the second thing is how much data I have within myself to figure out what is going on. Now, in this new world, AI kind of completely subsidizes us in terms of both those things. The AI has a lot of knowledge. In fact, it has the whole internet within itself. And it can actually work with intelligence on all those aspects. So my question was that why don't we use standalone AI models to do this risk estimates? Because AI has a lot of information. It is wise, and we can also use reinforcement learning to form more such neural network structures where we can actually make different models of the same thing, and then every model would give us a different estimate. So that will be like, with one AI we can make around maybe, I don't know, 100 to 200 more by reinforcement learning, we can find more AIs which can actually work on the same thing. It is like bringing in more wise people to work on the same thing, but they're just wiser. So my question was, why don't we just completely focus on artificial intelligence on risk estimates, and why do we need people for that?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question, but it can basically be asked about anything. like, it sort of seems like AI is maybe near the point of being able to replace sort of everything. It is already kind of able to replace some things. So in some cases, it's able to replace something, but we aren't letting it replace it for like sort of random sentimentalist reasons. Like my understanding is now AI can just do like really good art. And probably it'll be a long time before that massively reduces the art industry. Like my guess is the art industry won't reduce by 90% for a while. And I think the main reason for that is because people like art made by humans. They like the fact it's made by humans. So that is like an unnecessary barrier. But I think in this case, but in most cases, like it's just that the AI is in fact not actually good enough to do all the things that humans can do yet. And my guess is that's the case for existential risk estimation and for forecasting in general. AI seems quite good at forecasting. Okay, cool. It seems quite good at forecasting for like really well-specified questions in domains with a lot of data. But with a lot of the questions that like Metaculus works on, you sort of need like multiple lines of somewhat qualitative evidence and stuff like that. And my understanding is just AIs aren't very good at that yet. They probably will be pretty soon. They already can do some pieces of this. Metaculus is already working on some ways of integrating AI into its platform to help with forecasting. I'm excited about that. I'm also a bit worried about it because like, smarter AIs is also a problem in some ways. But yeah, trying to use it to help inform useful decision-making that helps reduce risks seems good. Some people should be working on it. A lot of people should still, but I think for like at least 10 years, probably humans will still be pretty useful, especially for making questions. I think we don't have time for a follow-up. I think we're, how do you, people running the room, should I take one more question or stop there? Okay. Maybe quick last one. Oh, no? Okay.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick then. I'm from Ukraine, and so the talk about like nuclear weapons felt much more relevant to me than just like theoretical, trying to make estimates and stuff. And so that got me thinking about, like you were talking about how complex of a task it is to like forecast something long term. But I was thinking about the gap between that and also bad things happening like literally as we speak. And there might be a nuclear threat like right now, in my country, AI systems getting capable, like right now as we speak. So what are the fields in which this kind of like gap within EA fields? In EA community, what are the fields in which this gap is like still very big? And maybe are there any fields in which these attempts to do long-term forecast is actually able to yield some sort of effective interventions right now? So trying to do a really quick answer, I care about the long-term future, but I care about events that would affect that in the next few decades, which can even be in the next 2 years or whatever. Like nuclear risk or biocatastrophe could happen very soon, pandemics as well. That same biocatastrophe. So I'm not talking about forecasting the long-term future, I'm talking about forecasting like 5 to 20 years. Even for nuclear risk, most nuclear risk comes more than 2 years from now, just because like each year there's some risk, and it's not very likely it happens in the next 2 years. But also forecasts of like what's going to happen in the next 5 to 20 years can inform interventions we do today that also reduce risk today. So I do agree with that. So if I figure out like how's nuclear risk going to play out over the next 10, 20 years, that informs what I do today. What I do today has some side benefits for some other things that happen soon. There's much more I could say, but I got to stop there. Feel free to like message me on Swapcard and stuff, and there's the link to the slides. Thanks for coming, everyone.